Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is Russia and their involvement in Libya. As a landmass, Libya is enormous. It's 3 times the size of Texas, about 7 times larger than the United Kingdom. And yet, we know so little about this North African nation. You probably don't know this. Most people don't. But for the past 5 years, Libya has been enveloped in a civil war. It is the Tobruk, aka the House of Representatives, versus the General National Congress. While it may sound purely political, this is a true military war. Who does know about it? Well, Vladimir Putin, that's for sure. For years, the Russians have been investing money and weapons in order to sway the outcome of this conflict. They are rooting for and supporting Tobruk. And now, and I mean right now, Russia has put specialists with experience on the ground in Libya. The numbers are, of course, fuzzy. This is Russia we're dealing with. But we do know that there are dozens of Russian snipers, Russian hardware, and at least 200 Russian soldiers in Libya. Russian weaponry includes guided missiles and fighter jets. And there are many, many Russian mercenaries. These mercenaries function as a private Russian army, and they are extremely useful because they are not soldiers. The mercenaries are unshackled and can do things an army cannot do. They are not bound by the Geneva Convention or, in many cases, their consciousness. Loyalty is not their issue. They are quite literally hired guns, and they are in it only for the money. Hundreds of drones are being used by the Russians in Libya. The drones are operated by people with great experience in civil wars. Their training ground was Syria. And these Russian soldiers, the mercenaries, came to the civil war after having gained vast experience and bona fides in that civil war-torn country, Syria. What is the reason for Russia's interest in Libya? It's more than just another example of how Putin and Russia are outsmarting everyone else. And it's more than another illustration of Russia's flexing of mighty military muscles and increasing its influence in the Middle East. The answer has 3 letters, and they are O-I-L. Oil reserves in Libya are immense. Despite the internal conflict, Libya is still pumping 1.3 million barrels of oil a day. Compared to that, let's say, for instance, Iran, that's only pumping 250,000 barrels of oil per day. Or even Saudi Arabia, the second largest producer of oil in the world, which is pumping 12 million barrels of oil. That's 12% of the world's oil per day. All this with a war going on. And getting oil from Libya is much easier than getting it from other countries. Libya sits only 300 miles off the coast of Italy, so its proximity to Europe is another very important reason to secure those oil fields. Moving the oil via pipeline or tanker is very simple. In other words, Libya is a valuable asset to acquire. So why, you may ask, hasn't the United States stepped in? We are, after all, smarter, stronger, and more powerful than Russia. The answer to that question is isolationism. There are important reasons for a country, even a powerful country like the United States, to practice isolationism. Some are selfish reasons, but admirable nonetheless. Keeping U.S. troops out of harm's way is about as primary as you can get, and it seems to have become a priority for President Donald J. Trump. Unlike the United States, Russian President Vladimir Putin does not care about these issues or these troops like the United States does. That means that the United States is engaging in foreign policy with a disadvantage from the outset. U.S. foreign policy is becoming more and more a diplomatic mission and less a military mission. It will take years before we can properly evaluate the success or failure of that strategy. In the meantime, in the here and now, Russia knows what it wants and has figured out how to get it. Russia knows what is at stake in Libya and beyond. Putin has his eye on the money and on the oil. In Libya, he can get both and reap the tremendous profit for a very tiny investment. All that with almost no opposition and no contenders. For Putin, this civil war, tearing Libya apart, is an advantage. It was his easy way in. We just spoke about one of the President Trump's policy. Let's explore another side of President of the United States policies. I'm a believer in the adage that goes, give credit where credit is due. When President Donald J. Trump does the correct thing, the right thing, the against all odds thing, and scores a huge victory for freedom and for democracy and for the American way, he should be thanked. Everyone, and that means everyone, should stand up and applaud, even if you are a Republican or a Democrat, conservative or independent or libertarian. Even if you viscerally and intellectually really, really dislike Trump, you should applaud. You should acknowledge a job well done. It's no different than when your arch rival sports team makes a great play, a 1 in a million perfect triple play. You respect the players for the deed they accomplished, and you show your respect not by booing and hissing and displaying anti-placards and signs, but by acknowledging the greatness of what has been done and complimenting the opposing team. Eliminating Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is, in the world of international diplomacy and security, that 1 in a million perfect triple play. To have the Washington Post glorify Baghdadi, one of the most brutal murderers of the modern era, as, quote, an austere religious scholar, stuns in its absurdity and its disrespect for history and humanity. To continue on and eulogize this mastermind of mass murder with the words dies at 48 is to forgive him for all the pain and the sorrow that he has sown. And this was a rework of the original headline, which called Baghdadi terrorist in chief. The best that the Washington Post could do, and grudgingly so, was to conjure up a new headline, this time the third one, on their Monday morning website, one that read, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, extremist leader of Islamic State, dies at 48. Better, but is still far from a true depiction of the magnitude of the news, and certainly a whitewash of the details surrounding his demise. This venerable newspaper, now owned by Amazon founder and CEO and President Jeff Bezos, did not stand alone in its inability to compliment President Trump on a job well done. They covered the story because they had to, twisting a significant moment in military history into the glorification of a mass murderer. It's hard to imagine a disdain so deeply ingrained that headline writers, editors, publishers could not bring themselves to condemn evil and bless its destruction. Their hatred of the person who rid the world of such evil is greater than their hatred of a man who wished to kill each and every one of us and obliterate all that we believe in and have fought so hard to achieve. A man who thought nothing of burning people alive and that massacred tens of thousands of people was treated with more kindness and compassion than the man who just happens to be the elected leader of the most freedom-loving country in the world, who brought him down. I'm an equal opportunity critic. Everything that President Trump does as president is not perfect. And when I disagree with his policy statements, actions, or tweets, I explain where he was off base. I analyze his decision and provide honest feedback. I'm not biting or spiteful. I'm not hurtful. My critique is meant to advance the conversation, even to change policy, to bring about a more effective stance on the situation. I disagree with the president, his withdrawal of U.S. troops from Syria, and I stated my point. I also made it clear that I fully understand why he's doing what he did. I think he would appreciate the honesty and the analysis. And I know that it is how we should play the game. All thinkers can and should be able to disagree about ideas. And while all ideas should be respected, that is not what I'm seeing, hearing, reading in America today. Politics and political discourse have developed into a strident oppositional wrestling match. The opposition, and it makes no difference what side one is on, is treated as vapid, insensitive, wrong, and downright evil. For the left, Donald Trump has become a symbol of that evil and of racism and of oppression. Their consensus is that everyone who supports Trump or votes for Trump is a racist. And analyzing the reaction we saw following the targeting of Baghdadi, that translates to mean that Trump supporters are worse than ISIS and Trump is worse than Baghdadi. That is the only way to explain how a major media organization, a newspaper of record, could warp reality with those ridiculous headlines. Intellectual honesty and ethics demands that we acknowledge the greatness of the moment, no matter what one thinks of the man who gave the order. Coming up next, points of view. Here's what some important voices have been talking about. I typically show you 2 or 3 columns and we discuss them. Today I want to look at just one column. It's long, 2 times the size of a normal column, so it's okay in that way. But it's not just the size that makes this column different from others. The column is written by Bernie Sanders. He writes about how we fight anti-Semitism. In fact, that is the title of the column. The piece offers insight into Bernie Sanders, the man, not just a politician and the presidential contender. It's a peek into his vision and the direction he wants to take the country if elected. The column was stimulated by the 1-year anniversary of the Pittsburgh Synagogue Massacre. It was published in Jewish Currents, an independent progressive publication of politics, arts, and culture. Jewish Currents was founded in 1946 and describes itself as a magazine committed to the rich tradition of thought, activism, and culture and of the Jewish left. Until 1955, it was officially controlled by the U.S. Communist Party. I don't remember reading Jewish Currents before this article. This was my first venture, and that is very telling both for me and for Bernie Sanders, who chose to have his thought piece published in this particular publication. This piece was published on November 11th, 2019. To state the obvious, the place, the piece, in context. Bernie Sanders is a United States Senator from Vermont and a candidate in the 2020 Democratic presidential primary. Of course, the piece is filled with critique of President Trump, some valid and some invalid, but the essential point is not Trump, and I stay away from that. It is anti-Semitism, and I want to stick to his point and take it on. This is how Sanders begins. On October 27th, we marked 1 year since the worst anti-Semitic attack in our country's history, when the white nationalists walked into the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh and murdered 11 people and injured 6 others. The murderer acted on the twisted belief that Jews were part of a nefarious plot to undermine white America, a plot to assist the invasion of the United States by a caravan of migrants from Latin America. This vicious lie about an invasion had been repeated endlessly in the right-wing media, on Fox News, across the internet, and most disgracefully by the President of the United States. Now Sanders speaks personally about anti-Semitism and his family. This is an unusual admission for him. He explains why. The threat of anti-Semitism is not some abstract idea to me. It is very personal. It destroyed a large part of my family. I'm not someone who spends a lot of time talking about my personal background because I believe political leaders should focus their attention on the vision and agenda for others rather than themselves. But I also appreciate that it's important to talk about how our backgrounds have informed our ideas, our principles, and our values. I am a proud Jewish American. My father emigrated from Poland to the United States in 1921 at the age of 17 to escape the poverty and widespread anti-Semitism of his home country. Those in his family who remained in Poland after Hitler came to power were murdered by the Nazis. I know very well where white supremacist politics leads and what can happen when people do not speak up against it. Now Senator Sanders gives evidence that anti-Semitism is real and rising, and he gives numbers and details from the FBI and the New York Police Department. The column continues. Anti-Semitism is rising in this country. According to the FBI, hate crimes against Jews rose by more than 1/3 in 2017 and accounted for 58% of all religious-based hate crimes in America. A total of 938 hate crimes were committed against Jews in 2017, up from 684 in 2016. The New York Police Department reported in September that anti-Semitic hate crimes in New York City have risen by more than 63% in 2019 alone and make up more than half of all reported hate crimes. Just last week on November 4th, we learned that federal authorities had arrested a man in Colorado they believe was involved in a plot to bomb one of the state's oldest synagogues. Sanders explains how important it is for progressives to fight anti-Semitism. He also explains how one can critique Israel and not be an anti-Semite. He writes, opposing anti-Semitism is a core value of progressivism. So it's very troubling to me that we are also seeing accusations of anti-Semitism used as a cynical political weapon against progressives. One of the most dangerous things Trump has done is to divide Americans by using false allegations of anti-Semitism, mostly regarding the U.S.-Israel relationship. We should be very clear that it is not anti-Semitic to criticize the policies of the Israeli government. Sanders describes his personal relationship with Israel. He explains his kibbutz experience. Again, this is not a topic he speaks about often. The column continues. I have a connection to Israel going back many years. In 1963, I lived on a kibbutz near Haifa. It was there that I saw and experienced for myself many progressive values upon which Israel was founded. I think it is very important for everyone, particularly for progressives, to acknowledge the enormous achievement of establishing a democratic homeland for the Jewish people after centuries of displacement and persecution. Now Sanders explains further that recognizing the faults of Israel does not make you anti-Israel. According to Bernie Sanders, he writes, we must also be honest about this. The founding of Israel is understood by another people in the land of Palestine as the cause of their painful displacement. And just as Palestinians should recognize the just claims of Israeli Jews, supporters of Israel must understand why Palestinians view Israel's creation as they do. Acknowledging these realities does not delegitimize Israel any more than acknowledging the sober facts of America's own founding delegitimizes the United States. It is a necessary step of truth and reconciliation in order to address the inequalities that continue to exist in our respective societies. Now we come to the crux of his personal progressive ideals. Sanders explains that his support of Israel and the Palestinians exists side by side. He argues that fighting the occupation will allow the Palestinians self-determination. Ending the occupation and enabling the Palestinians to have self-determination in an independent, democratic, economically viable state of their own is in the best interest of the United States, Israel, the Palestinians, and the region. My pride and admiration for Israel lives alongside my support for Palestinian freedom and independence. I reject the notion that there is any contradiction there. The forces fomenting anti-Semitism are the forces arrayed against oppressed people around the world, including Palestinians. The struggle against anti-Semitism is also the struggle for Palestinian freedom. I stand in solidarity with my friends in Israel, in Palestine, and around the world who are trying to resolve conflict, diminish hatred, and promote dialogue, cooperation, and understanding. Sanders concludes his column positing that his progressive point of view is his Jewish tradition. This is how he writes it. As a people who have experienced oppression and persecution for hundreds of years, we understand the danger, but we also have a tradition that points the way forward. I'm a proud member of the tradition of Jewish social justice, and I am so inspired when I see so many Jewish people picking up this banner, especially the younger generation of Jews, who are helping to lead a revival of progressive values in our country. They see the fight against anti-Semitism and for Jewish liberation as connected to the fight for the liberation of oppressed people around the world. They are part of a broad coalition of activists from many different backgrounds who believe very deeply, as I always have, that we are all in this together. In many ways, Sanders is right, and in just as many ways, he's wrong. The most important element to know is that Jewish socialists and communists of the past fought against terrible anti-Semitism in their own movements. Their sine qua non was to fight for equality in the world. I think this piece shows us a much deeper side of Bernie Sanders than he usually offers up in public and during his speeches and debates. You can agree or disagree with his argument, but not whether he has thought it through. This column truly represents a progressive point of view on Israel and anti-Semitism. He is one of the most articulate spokespeople for that group. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. Let's discuss 3 cartoons today. 2 of them are about the Saudi Twitter spying operation. A bit of background. Saudi Arabia hired Twitter employees to penetrate the security and ID section of Twitter and deliver details on people who expressed critical ideas of the Saudi kingdom. The names and addresses they gathered included expats and journalists. They also included details on how to track those people on GPS. This first cartoon is from Al Arabi Al Jadid, which is an Arab paper published in London. The cartoon is by Imad Hajjaj. The Saudi prince is on the blue bird that is the Twitter symbol. He's holding a bloody saw in one hand, and in his ear to help him hear is a funnel dripping with blood. It's entitled Twitter Spying. The second cartoon is a spoof on Sesame Street. This street is called Sally Street. The Crown Prince has a Twitter bird on his head, and he's hiding behind the blue bird's feathers. The piece is by Bart van Leeuwen and was published in politicalcartoons.com. This last cartoon is a lampoon of the Washington Post headline that we spoke about earlier, that we discussed in this whole column of the ISIS founder and leader al-Baghdadi blew himself up in the United States raid in Syria. The Post called al-Baghdadi an austere religious scholar dies at 87. That was the headline. In this scene, the cartoonist presents an image of the Emperor Palpatine from Star Wars. He is evil. And the headline reads, "An austere religious scholar dies at 87. This came from Powerline blog on November 2nd. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Iran's president announced that the Iranians have discovered a huge new oil reserve. President Rouhani said that they discovered a source containing 53 billion barrels of oil about 100 yards below the ground. If true, this treasure trove will only be slightly smaller than the largest Iranian oil system, which contains 63 billion barrels. If true, this would also move Iran into the number 3 spot in the list of countries with the greatest oil reserves. If true, this discovery is so large that it would increase the total OPEC reserves by 34%. That's how big it is. Add to that the announcement that Iran made last month about new discovery of natural gas. Something very big is happening in Iran. The announcements, if true, are made publicly in an effort to reposition Iran in the eyes of its supporters. The message Iran is sending out is that they are not down in the dumps. Rather, they are major players in the sphere of oil and natural gas. The most important, albeit unspoken, point in all of these messages is that the United States is preventing Iran from tapping these resources. The United States will not permit Iran to extract and sell their badly needed natural resources. The resources are badly needed by the world, and the revenue is badly needed by Iran. These announcements help resuscitate Iran's image. Jordan and Israel signed a peace treaty on October 26, 1994. I was actually there. The signing took place somewhere in the Arava. Not only was I there, I experienced the historic and emotional meaning of it. Now, 25 years later, Jordan is walking back 2 elements in the treaty. The Jordanians are not breaking the treaty. Provisions there are to reclaim certain areas included in the original document, and the Jordanians have decided to exercise that option. Number 1 is Naharaim. Naharaim is an island in where the Yarmouk and the Jordan rivers merge. The spot is very important. It's a freshwater pumping station and controls the water of the Jordan Valley. Parenthetically, it is also the site where in 1997 the terrible massacre took place and 7 Israeli high school girls were gunned down by a Jordanian soldier. The second element is a place called Sofar. Sofar is a plot of land in the Arava Desert in the south. Once a dry and barren area, thanks to Israel, care, and agricultural science, it's now a cultivated and flourishing area. Both of these areas are reverting back to Jordanian control. They're actually in their hands already. The government of Jordan put forth the request a year ago, as clearly articulated in the 1994 peace agreement. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo visited the synagogue in Halle, Germany, where a man threw bombs and shot people outside their synagogue. A Jewish massacre in the synagogue was averted only because those already inside the synagogue for prayers locked themselves in. Secretary Pompeo wanted to take a stand against anti-Semitism. He also urged others to fight against anti-Semitism. The Secretary of State said anti-Semitism is not just limited to certain places. We can find it everywhere, like in Pittsburgh. We must work together against this vicious attack on religious freedom. Pompeo is more than correct to fight anti-Semitism. Where he misses the point, however, is that the hatred is not about religion and the practice of Judaism. The problem anti-Semites have is not universal hatred against religion. Their problem is with Jews. Anti-Semites have no problem with Judaism. Here's a bit more background on the details of the Saudi Arabian Twitter story. According to charges filed in San Francisco, Saudi Arabia is directly connected to spying on Twitter users in America between May 21st, 2015 and November 18th, 2018. 2 dual citizens of the United States and Saudi Arabia and 1 Saudi national were charged with accessing Twitter details and delivering the data to the Saudis. The case is shocking. 2 Twitter employees and 1 handler were responsible for collecting the data on 6,000 critics of the Saudi regime, not just their names and usernames. They also accessed the metadata, the material that can show the geographic location of the user. They did it in exchange for money and gifts. Ahmed Abu Mamu, one of the dual citizens, was a media partnership manager at Twitter. He received $300,000 and a 20,000 Hubolt watch, paid by an unnamed person referred to as Saudi National 1. Ali Al-Zabara, the second Saudi U.S. dual citizen, worked at Twitter as a site reliability engineer. He was confronted for accessing private Twitter info, which was outside his job responsibilities. The next day, he resigned by sending an email from a plane. He was on his way back to Saudi Arabia with his handler. With the info gained from these spies, the Saudi government boldly put into a request for Twitter for information on 33 usernames in what they called an emergency disclosure. Twitter admits that the nature of the industry creates bad actors who will try to undermine its service, and that the company, quote, limits access to sensitive account information to a limited group of trained and vetted employees, unquote. The company's statement read, "We understand the incredible risks faced by many of those who use Twitter to share their perspectives with the world and to hold those in power accountable. We have tools in place to protect their privacy and their ability to do their vital work." This entire episode is very troubling. The redeeming point is that the Saudis were charged and that the government was named. If you remember, the 9/11 hijackers were Saudis. Mysteriously, despite the fact that all flights in the United States were grounded, private Saudi planes flew, returning many Saudi nationals to the kingdom. The United States has and continues to block any move to investigate how the Saudis were involved. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that we throw around the words socialism and communism all the time? It's worth introducing and explaining their role in the Jewish world and their impact. In the early 1900s, the socialist and communist movements became very powerful. Supporters wanted to change the world. Remember the phrase, "workers of the world unite." These movements challenged the established rules of society. They wanted equality, and they wanted to overthrow oppressive models of government and industry. Jews were very involved, but there was a problem, because even there, the communists and socialists were tremendously anti-Semitic. So Jews created their own parallel movements: Jewish socialism, Jewish communism. The Bund, the Jewish Workers' Party, was an example of that. They put their own spin on it. Already existing movement, they put their own spin on. The Workmen's Circle is another example. The Yiddishists and their newspapers and radios were other examples. These movements grew powerfully in the United States. They helped teach Jewish Americans about democracy, about power, about organizing. Members were the unionizers and the organizers. They instilled in workers the power to vote. There were also Hebrew socialisms, Hebrew communism. The Hebrew socialist movement was the movement that built Israel. This is the world that Bernie Sanders was discussing. It was a rich, exciting Jewish society. It was filled with Jewish values. It was also fighting anti-Semitism. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please, indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.